The Cellar. Welcome to another collection of Horrible Fates. As always, I like to be upfront that this is a collection of stories I've already told on the channel. Some of you wait and prefer to watch these larger collections, and they tend to be the most popular videos on the channel. I just want to make sure anyone watching understands what these collections are. So thank you all for watching and supporting the channel, and if you enjoy the video, please consider subscribing and hit that like button below. It helps a ton. And without further ado, let's dive into this collection of Horrible Fates. Emily Hartridge was born on the 25th of May, 1984, in Hambledon, Hampshire, England. Emily grew up with multiple sisters and had a dream of growing up and being on TV. She was described as always being an entertainer, and on February 5th of 2007, she created her first YouTube channel. Her channel would lay dormant until August of 2011, when she would upload her first video titled A Long Weekend in Berlin. This first video of hers was primarily a vlog-style video documenting her travels through the German city.
We're just walking along a Berlin street called Hein something Blenheimstraßenblummen. I don't know what it's called, but it's pretty. So we've been in Berlin for about 4 hours. We sat on the bed, we walked around, and now we're drinking German wine, which is actually surprisingly really nice.
Following this initial video, Emily would begin uploading a different style of content, her 10 Reasons Why videos. These videos would basically be Emily coming up with a subject, sometimes topics considered controversial, and then she would give her 10 reasons why she felt a specific way about each topic. The more Emily uploaded, the more her videos and channel started to take off. It was clear that Emily had quite the sense of humor, and those that discovered her content were quick to keep coming back for more. Emily's channel really started taking off when she started diving into topics that were sexual in nature. Videos like You Should Have Sex Every Day, 10 Reasons Why, and Women Watch Porn, 10 Reasons Why, would garner thousands and sometimes millions of views. Her most popular video ever was titled You Should Have Sex with Your Ex, 10 Reasons Why. This video would eventually break 20 million views and currently sits at 26 million views this very day.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to 10 Reasons Why. Sorry again for not doing a video last week. I'm not going to lie. I was doing this. And this. And a lot of this. 10 reasons why you should sleep with your ex. 1. It's easy. You're both going through a dry spell. You're both still single. You both know where each other lives. Simple.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good. Haven't seen you in a while. How are you?
Yeah. No. Good.
Good.
You're good. Everything's good.
Yeah. It's quite cold outside.
Cold. Yeah, it is.
So what have you eaten today?
Had some. Should we go to the bedroom?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was easy at this point to see why Emily was garnering a ton of support on YouTube. She had a very open, candid, and fun personality. She wasn't afraid to tackle topics that a lot of people are afraid to explore. Her lighthearted and funny personality really pulled you in, and you couldn't help but feel like you were watching someone who was truly genuine. There are a lot of creators out there that come across as fake, to put it as bluntly as I can. But Emily was not one of those creators. When you watched her content, you truly felt like she was opening a window and allowing you into her life, for better or for worse. Eventually, Emily's channel would break the 100,000 subscriber mark, followed shortly by 200,000 and then 300,000 subscribers. Her success on YouTube would eventually lead to television producers looking to hire her to be a presenter. Being on TV was a dream that Emily had from a young age, and her YouTube career was opening up doors to her achieving said dreams. Emily would eventually accept a position as a celebrity interviewer, where she would go on to interview the likes of Russell Brand and Hugh Jackman.
Do it again, Ellie.
This is going super.
Rock of Ages is a type of a film.
No, they're not for you, just those.
I'm keeping these.
No.
It's all I've ever wanted. These.
Don't throw back at me! Oh my god! I'm gonna have one of them now.
She would continue uploading on YouTube, where she would open up to the public about everything, discussing her secrets, insecurities, and the overall ups and downs of her life. Emily was a real person, talking about real problems, and those that tuned into her channel really appreciated the open and honest conversations that Emily would have. This now brings us to the last video that Emily would ever upload. The video was titled 10 Reasons to Get a Younger Boyfriend. In the video, Emily and her boyfriend, who is roughly 8 years younger than her, dive into the numerous reasons why having a younger boyfriend was great. What no one knew at the time was that one portion of this video would be directly connected to Emily's future demise. In the video, Emily's boyfriend gifts her 2 scooters. I will play that portion of the video for you now.
All the younger guys I've dated have been more romantic than the older ones. I don't care if they're doing it to try and impress me. I like it.
Ready, baby?
Yeah?
One sec.
Okay.
Happy birthday.
Oh my god, 2 scooters!
Yeah, you know that.
Why'd you get me 2?
Well, this one's a 6. It's got your name on it. And then this is the one you can use to work. It's all electric and apparently the best one in the game.
Oh my god, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Now we will jump to July 12th of 2019. Emily was riding her electric scooter on the Queen's Circus roundabout in Battersea, London. She was on her way to a fertility clinic at the time when she suddenly lost control of the scooter. As she attempted to regain control, she would veer out in front of a massive truck. The truck had no time to react as it drove straight into Emily, ending her life right then and there. At the time, Emily was only 35 years old. Her death would come as an absolute shock, with numerous news outlets picking up the story, and even YouTube released a statement stating, "We are deeply saddened to learn about the tragic loss of a truly talented British creator, Emily Hartridge. Our thoughts and condolences go out to all her loved ones and fans." Following this unbelievable tragedy, in September of 2020, a coroner ruled that Hartridge had lost control of her scooter due to it being unsuitably driven too fast and with an underinflated tire. Emily Hartridge is believed to be the first person to die in the United Kingdom in an accident involving an e-scooter. Emily's boyfriend would later state that he absolutely regretted ever buying her that electric scooter. I can only imagine the pain and guilt he feels over the situation. But he never could have known what would happen, and I hope he has been able to find some peace within, as it truly wasn't his fault. At the end of the day, Emily Hartridge was a young and talented creator who had so much more life left ahead of her. Her infectious personality will forever be missed, and I want to send my deepest condolences out to all her friends, family, and supporters. Emily, you will be missed. Joseph Arity was born on April 29, 1915, in Pueblo, Colorado. Pueblo is situated at the joining of the Arkansas River and Fountain Creek. It is 112 miles or 180 kilometers south of the Colorado state capital in Denver. Joseph was born to parents Mary and Henry Arity. Mary and Henry had arrived in Colorado in 1909 from Patras, Greece. In search of work, Henry took a job within a steel mill located in Pueblo. The couple did not speak English at the time, and they were first cousins from Barosha, a village in Mount Lebanon, Mutasarrifate, Syria. Joseph Arity was the eldest of the couple's 3 children. It's said that Joseph was nonverbal for the first 5 years of his life. As he continued to grow older, he began speaking in very short, simple sentences. As he grew into an adult, he typically did not speak to anyone unless he was spoken to first. When Joseph was sent to elementary school, his time there was cut very short, as after only 1 year, the principal told Joseph's parents that he needed to stay home. His reasoning was that Joseph simply could not learn. In October of 1925, Joseph would be admitted to the State Home and Training School for Mental Defectives in Grand Junction, Colorado. At the time, Joseph was only 10 years old. While attending the home, the Arity family was brought in to undergo psych tests. Those tests concluded that his mother, Mary, was feeble-minded, and his brother, George, was considered a high moron. These were terms used to describe those with mental handicaps back in the early 1900s. That now takes us to September 17th of 1929. Joseph Arity was assaulted by a group of teen boys. I won't get into all the gritty details, but it was a horrible situation. And during the altercation, Joseph's juvenile probation officer walked in on the scene. He would write up a complaint letter to the school's superintendent, but ultimately the entire situation was misrepresented as consensual in nature. In his report, he also stated that Joseph was one of the worst mental defective cases he had ever seen, claiming he was a moral danger to society. The way people viewed and treated those like Joseph back then was terrible, to put it simply. Joseph's time at the school going forward involved him being beat up and abused. That was until August of 1936. At 21 years old, Joseph Arity left the school grounds with 4 other young men. They stowed away in freight carts and traveled through Colorado and Utah for several weeks before ending up in Cheyenne, Wyoming. In Wyoming, Joseph would eventually walk up to a kitchen car, where he asked workers for some much-needed food. The supervisors, Mr. and Mrs. Glenn Gibson, would allow Joseph to stay with the crew. They gave him clean clothes and allowed him to work as a dishwasher. He would work all day in order to earn food to survive. This lasted for about 6 days as the train car was heading out of state. Joseph was not officially an employee, and thus the Gibsons told Joseph that he could not go with them. They drove him back to the rail yard in Cheyenne, Wyoming. That now takes us to August 14th, 1936. 2 girls of the Drain family would be attacked while fast asleep within their home in Pueblo, Colorado. Both 15-year-old Dorothy and her 12-year-old sister Barbara Drain were hit by an intruder with a hatchet. Dorothy was SA'd and would end up losing her life as a result of the attack, while Barbara ended up surviving the ordeal. Following this incident, a fellow runaway from Joseph's school would tell workers that he and Joseph had passed through Pueblo in the late hours of August 16th. But according to the boy, Joseph never left the rail yard and soon proceeded to get on a train to Denver, Colorado. On the night of August 26, 1936, Joseph Arity was arrested by 2 railroad detectives for vagrancy in Cheyenne, Wyoming. At the time, Joseph was caught wandering around the rail yards. He was soon brought to jail, where he was questioned by the Laramie County Sheriff, George Carroll. George knew of the search for suspects in the Drain murder case, and while questioning Joseph, it was revealed that he had traveled through Pueblo. George began questioning Joseph about the Drain case, and according to George Carroll, Joseph confessed his guilt to him. George Carroll would soon contact the Pueblo police chief. He then proceeded to contact the local press, who reported the news the next morning, naming Joseph Arity as the sole perpetrator in the Drain girls' attack. In February of 1937, the case against Joseph would be taken to trial. Joseph's lawyer pleaded insanity to avoid the death penalty for his client. During the case, George Carroll testified in court that Arity was mentally fit and fully aware of his actions, stating as well that Joseph was articulate during questioning and provided accurate information during the crime scene reenactment. He also stated that Joseph showed great remorse over what had occurred in private to him. Joseph Arity was eventually ruled to be sane, even though 3 state psychiatrists acknowledged that Joseph was extremely mentally limited. They referred to Joseph as an imbecile, an actual medical term at the time. Joseph's IQ was a 46, and his mind was that of a 6-year-old child. How someone like him could be deemed fit to stand trial is beyond me. It was also stated that he was unable to recognize right and wrong, meaning he was unable to perform any actions with a criminal intent. During the trial, Joseph's lawyer allowed the prosecutors to ask him numerous questions, including one about whether or not he had ever seen a hatchet. Joseph didn't know what one was, or even what one looked like. He did not know who George Washington was, and he didn't know how to distinguish the difference between a nickel and a dime. During further questioning within the trial, it came to light that Joseph didn't know who Dorothy or Barbara Drain even were. There was little actual evidence to prove within a reasonable doubt that Joseph Arity had committed the crimes he was being accused of. Even so, on April 17th, Joseph Arity was found guilty. This guilty verdict came about primarily because of his false confession. Joseph Arity would be sentenced to death. While going through the appeals process, Joseph was often found playing with the toy train that he had received as a present from the prison warden, Roy Best. Roy would later state that Joseph was the happiest prisoner he had ever had on death row. Joseph was liked and treated well by both prisoners and guards. The prison warden, Roy Best, would eventually become a supporter of Joseph's, joining in on the efforts to save his life. It is said that Roy cared for Joseph like he was his own son, providing him with gifts, toys, picture books, and crayons. The saddest aspect of this case was that Joseph didn't even have a full understanding of what was going to happen to him. That now brings us to the morning of January 6, 1939. Just a few hours before his execution that same evening, Joseph Arity received an unscheduled final visitation from his family, which had been arranged as a surprise by Warden Best. Joseph's father had passed away in February of 1937, and he had not been able to attend his funeral. Joseph had not seen his mother since his incarceration, and it was said that Joseph displayed an emotional numbness through the 15-minute visit he had with his family. The only time Joseph showed any emotion was when a 3-gallon bucket of ice cream was brought out for him and his family to eat together. When Joseph was questioned about his upcoming execution, he clearly did not understand what was about to happen. He was allowed a final meal, which ended up being some more ice cream. In fact, he didn't even finish his ice cream. He asked for it to be refrigerated so that he could eat it later on, not realizing that there was no later on. Roy Best would accompany Joseph on his walk to the gas chamber, talking about the prison chicken coop on the way there. It is reported that Joseph smiled before he entered the chamber. There, Joseph was given his last rites before being blindfolded. The blindfold upset him temporarily, but Roy Best grabbed his hand and reassured him, finally calming Joseph down. Roy Best was said to have been in tears during the entire ordeal, pleading with the governor of Colorado to commute Joseph's sentence before the execution. But no matter how much Roy Best pled, Teller Ammons, the governor of Colorado, refused to commute Joseph's sentence or to pardon him. With no pardon coming, there was nothing else that Roy could do. He would sit back and watch as the gas would soon fill the chamber, and Joseph Arity's life would end. Now, this case is a tragic and heartbreaking one, especially knowing what we know now, that Joseph Arity was 100% innocent. At the time of his forced confession, another man named Frank Aguilar had already been arrested as the prime suspect in this case. I won't dive into all of the details, but Aguilar had worked for the father of the 2 Drain girls. To put it simply, the police decided to place the blame on both Joseph and Aguilar. The police would later state that Frank and Joseph had met by chance and carried out the attacks together. Frank Aguilar would claim that Joseph was in on it, but his account was later recanted as he stated that his life was threatened by Police Chief Grady if he didn't implicate Joseph Arity. In reality, Frank Aguilar was the only one who should have paid for this crime. He confessed, and ultimately the evidence pointed in his direction. Investigators would find an axe head with notches matching the wounds inflicted on both Drain girls, as well as a calendar with the date August 15th marked. Investigators also found newspaper clippings containing articles about sex slangs taped to the surrounding wallpaper. Frank Aguilar was later tried for the same crime Joseph Arity was tried for. He was sentenced to death row, and on August 13th of 1937, Frank Aguilar's life was ended. It would take decades, but eventually, Joseph Arity's case would be one that received new attention in the face of research into ensuring just interrogations and confessions are obtained. The U.S. Supreme Court would later rule that capital punishment was unconstitutional for convicted people who are mentally disabled. Attorney David A. Martinez would get involved in Joseph Arity's case. He relied heavily on Robert Perucchi's book about Arity's case, while also doing his own research. He would prepare a 400-page petition for pardon. In 2011, Governor Bill Ritter would finally give Joseph Arity a full and unconditional pardon. He stated, "Pardoning Joe Arity cannot undo this tragic event in Colorado history. It is in the interests of justice and simple decency, however, to restore his good name." This is a tragic story of a man being abused by society and the justice system every step of the way. Joseph Arity was treated poorly because of his mental disabilities, something that all too often occurred throughout history. My deepest condolences go out to Joseph Arity, his family, his friends, and all those that fought over the years to finally clear his good name. Sterkfontein is a set of limestone caves of special interest in paleoanthropology. The caves are located in Gauteng province, about 40 kilometers or 25 miles northwest of Johannesburg, South Africa. A little fun fact, Johannesburg itself has been one of director Neil Blomkamp's favorite shooting locations for films he has done in the past. Most notably, the excellent sci-fi film District 9 was filmed there, as well as the movie Chappie. The Sterkfontein Caves are located in an area that has become known as the cradle of humankind. It's been given this name as it is the home to the largest known concentration of human ancestral remains anywhere in the world. In the late 1890s, modern excavation of the caves would begin. Early miners would immediately notice an abundance of fossils. With these early discoveries, a lot of attention was brought to the caves, including many scientists who were interested in studying the many discoveries and secrets this part of the world had to offer. In 1936, further excavations of the Sterkfontein Cave would begin. Soon, a discovery was made of the first adult Australopithecine. What is an Australopithecine, you may ask? Well, I won't act like I'm an expert, but from my research I found that Australopithecus was an adaptive radiation of hominis that lived 4.2 to 2 million years ago. To put it even more simply, they were a group of extinct primates and humans' earliest dated ancestor. Soon after these discoveries, World War II would begin. This would put a stop to all work within the caves until after the war had finally come to an end. Dr. Robert Broom would soon continue his work, and in 1947 he discovered a nearly complete skull of an adult female. The skull would widely go on to be known as Mrs. Pless. Mrs. Pless is the popular nickname for the most complete skull of an Australopithecus africanus ever found in South Africa. And that now brings us to September 29th, 1984, the day that today's story takes place. On this day, 29-year-old Peter Verhulst and two of his friends made the decision to go cave diving in the Sterkfontein Caves. Peter was described by those who knew him as an adrenaline junkie, a man that was not afraid of anything and had no issue staring fear in the face. He had an appetite for taking risks, and those risks were no different as he and two of his buddies entered the water and began exploring the Sterkfontein cave system. To provide some further context, this wasn't Peter's first time exploring the cave system. If you asked Peter himself, he would most likely have told any of us that he was a very experienced cave diver. But in reality, he was the most inexperienced diver out of the group on that day in September of 1984. Cave diving, no matter how experienced or how confident you may be, is extremely dangerous. Just from diving into a handful of stories myself, I recognize that anything and everything can go wrong, even for the most experienced and prepared divers. As Peter and his friends ventured into the cave, their goal on this day was to measure the depth of the lake that was located in Milner Hall. Milner Hall being one of the many chambers within the cave that had already been discovered and named prior to 1984. The group of men had talked prior and had a very simple plan laid out for the day. Follow the guideline in until it ended, and then turn around and come right back out of the cave. The entire dive was expected to take under an hour in total, and the men brought with them what they felt was more than enough gas for the trip. Each member of the group had one light fixed to them each as they entered the water and began following the guideline. Peter Verhusel would end up as the rearmost diver in the group as they worked their way through the passages ahead of them. As the group reached the middle of the cave, one of Peter's friends noticed him wandering away from the guideline and heading down one of the many offshoots located within. The pair stopped and patiently waited for Peter and his light source to return to them. Luckily, after only a few moments, Peter would return and rejoin the group. It was at this point that one of Peter's friends would motion to him that he needed to stay with the guideline moving forward. The group would once again set off deeper into the cave, and once again, only minutes later, Peter would wander down another passage and away from the guideline. Peter's friends would wait for him, and once again, Peter would return. Now, these moments may seem like some harmless exploration, but one of the most important rules in cave diving is to never leave the guideline, or at the very least, never let the guideline out of your direct sight. Ultimately, Peter's propensity for risk-taking would end up being his undoing in the end. As the group continued on deeper into the cave, Peter would once again make the decision to wander off on his own and away from the guideline. Peter's friends would notice him going off to their right and down a passageway. They waited and watched his light disappear in the distance, expecting Peter to return once again, like he had done twice before. But as seconds turned to minutes, Peter and his light did not reappear. As Peter worked his way down the side passage, he would soon come to realize that the way he chose to go was a maze of passages and dead ends. Peter initially felt confident that he knew where he was going, but as he made his way back to his friends, he would begin running into dead end after dead end after dead end. The realization would soon come to Peter that he was completely lost. Peter would soon check his gas and came to a realization that he had burned through quite a bit of it already. Luckily for Peter, he managed to locate one of the many underwater lakes within the cave. I will display a picture that shows you all what one of these underwater lakes looks like so you can get an idea of the situation Peter was now in. Peter was able to pull himself out of the water and onto the island. He removed his mask and at the very least was happy in that moment that he would not drown in the water. At this point, Peter still had enough gas to get out of the cave, but only if he knew exactly where he was going and was able to find the guideline. He didn't have any clue as to where he needed to go, so he made the decision to sit there and wait patiently for rescue. Peter's friends would soon make every effort to try and locate Peter, but with their gas running low, they had to make the difficult decision to eventually leave the cave. Once they were outside, they soon called for help. Police divers would show up that evening and begin looking for Peter, but after not locating him all night, the search was soon called off. With the police now feeling confident that this was more of a body recovery than an actual search and rescue. Little did they know that Peter was still alive. As Peter had waited on his little island, he soon fell asleep from stress and exhaustion. He would awake and assumed it was the next day, but he really had no way of telling what time it was or how much time had passed. He had no food and very little battery power left in his flashlight. He had a little bit of gas left, but not enough to waste time trying to find a way out. He also knew that if he made another attempt to dive out of there, he may not find his way back into the chamber full of oxygen. His best bet was to wait and continue to hope that someone found him. Outside of the cave, the rescue operation was still underway, but with rescuers believing that Peter had drowned, their focus had soon shifted to a body recovery. In the initial search for Peter, the passages had been stirred up quite a bit. When silt is stirred up, it can make visibility next to impossible. The rescue teams wanted to wait and let the cave settle, so they would end up waiting an entire week before they re-entered the cave. At this point, the police were only entering and searching for Peter on the weekends. Each week would pass, and the police would re-enter Saturday and Sunday, hoping to locate Peter's body. Inside the cave, Peter must have been in absolute hell. He had very little battery life, and very little gas to try and swim out of the cave. Peter must have been constantly battling with himself on whether or not to attempt to swim out of there. In complete darkness, the human psyche can break down, as light and sound deprivation can be one of the most horrifying forms of torture on the human brain. Peter kept waiting, starving slowly in the dark, alone, constantly hoping that someone would come up out of the water and rescue him from the absolute nightmare he was now living in. But that help didn't come. After a few weeks of waiting in the dark, Peter's body would slowly break down and lose fat and then muscle. He would get weaker and weaker, finally reaching a point where even if he wanted to try and swim out, his body simply couldn't function or sustain that kind of exertion. After weeks of surviving, all Peter could continue to do was wait. The police would continue their weekend searches for 6 weeks before finally calling off the recovery efforts. The police decided at this point to keep the wet portions of the cave closed off to divers, but they would allow the dry portions to reopen. As soon as the dry portions of the caves reopened, volunteers would begin exploring the caves in hopes of finding a connection of some kind with the water-filled cave that Peter had gotten lost within. Soon a connection with the caves that Peter had been lost within was found, and once this was found, it didn't take long before a discovery of footprints would be made. The footprints would be followed in both directions, and eventually an astonishing discovery would be made. The emaciated body of Peter Verhustle was discovered, still laying on the island right near the water's edge. It was apparent very quickly that Peter had not drowned like the police initially thought he did. In fact, Peter had astonishingly survived within the cave for around 3 to potentially 4 weeks before he simply starved to death. Near his body, written in the sand, a message was found. It simply read, "I love you, Cheryl and Ma." Cheryl was Peter's wife, the woman that he had long hoped he would find a way back to one day. Peter held on for weeks, pushing the human body and psyche to the absolute brink of what it's capable of. At the end of the day, what Peter endured, well, it's not something I would wish on my own worst enemy. It also begs the question, what if the police had kept the dry caves open? Could Peter have been discovered in time? Based on how quickly he was located once the caves were reopened, it leads one to believe that this story may have had a different outcome. Peter had no way to signal to anyone that he was still alive, and I'm sure he contemplated and struggled immensely with his decision to leave the guideline like he did on that day. At the end of it all, let's let Peter's story be a reminder of the dangers of cave diving. Let's also let it be a reminder of the dangers of not following the many golden rules of diving. My deepest condolences go out to Peter, as well as all of his family and friends. Today's story takes us to Disneyland. Disneyland is a breathtaking theme park located within Anaheim, California. It was the first theme park opened by the Walt Disney Company, and it was the only park ever designed and constructed under the direct supervision of the late, great Walt Disney himself. Walt Disney would purchase a 160-acre plot of land in Anaheim, and he began work on the park in 1954. The park would open to the public on July 17th of 1955. Disneyland has been entertaining those around the world for 70 years now, and the park has a larger cumulative attendance than any other theme park throughout the entire world. It's said that the park has been visited over 757 million times since its inception, with close to 17 million visits occurring in 2022 alone. Over the years, the park has undergone numerous renovations and expansions. Additions like New Orleans Square in 1966, Bear Country in 1972, Mickey's Toontown in 1993, and Star Wars Galaxy Edge in 2019. Now, I recently covered a heartbreaking story that transpired at Disneyland in July of 1974. 18-year-old Deborah Gale Stone was a new employee at the park, and she was crushed while working at the America Sings attraction. Her story is tragic to say the least, but she is not the only person to suffer a grisly end to their life while within the gates of a Disney park. Numerous incidents have occurred since the park's inception, and today's story will take us to one ride in particular. That ride being Roger Rabbit's Cartoon Spin. Roger Rabbit's Cartoon Spin opened in Disneyland on January 26, 1994. The ride was based on the Steven Spielberg and Robert Zemeckis award-winning film Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which was released in theaters on June 22, 1988. The Roger Rabbit's Cartoon Spin ride is considered a dark ride. For those that don't know what a dark ride is an indoor amusement ride on which passengers board guided vehicles. These guided vehicles then travel through specially lit scenes that typically contain animation, sound, music, and special effects. The intention of dark rides is to tell stories with thematic elements that immerse riders in the overall experience. Roger Rabbit's Cartoon Spin was located within the Mickey's Toontown section of the park. Since its inception in 1994, the ride had been an absolute hit amongst all the children visiting Disneyland. That was no different for 4-year-old Brandon Zucker. Brandon and his family were from Canyon Country, northern Los Angeles. Brandon was visiting the park in September of 2000 with his family. They had arrived at around 11 a.m. and had enjoyed a long and exciting day at the park. As the day started to wind down, Brandon had his eyes set on one last ride. The 4-year-old, like many other kids his age, loved everything about Mickey's Toontown. In particular, the Roger Rabbit's Cartoon Spin ride. Brandon made his want to go on the ride very clear, and soon he and his mother were boarding the zigzagging taxi car. The ride was designed to seat 2 people per taxi. The taxi cab would then wait for the traffic light to turn green before exiting the loading area and beginning the adventure through Toontown. The whole idea of the ride was that you were being taken on a tour of Toontown while the cab spun around at a full 360 degrees. Now, I have seen some different reporting on exactly how everyone was seated for this ride, but from what I have gathered, Brandon was seated near the opening at the passenger side door. His 6-year-old brother was also in the cab, while Brandon's mother sat behind the wheel of the taxi. Brandon's father and grandmother boarded the taxi cab just behind Brandon, following along on the adventure. The traffic light would soon turn green, and the ride was in motion, the same as it had done so many times before. But at the time, the family had no idea what horrors soon awaited them. A few minutes into the ride, Brandon's mother bent down to pick something up. Now, I have seen this reported a few ways, with one source stating that Brandon had dropped something out of the car. But nonetheless, within a blink of an eye, Brandon Zucker had fallen out of the taxicab car. Brandon's father witnessed the event from behind and stated that Brandon didn't even have enough time to scream. It happened so fast. Brandon's father would start yelling for help, yelling that his son had fallen out of the car and was now stuck underneath it. Brandon's father soon took action, jumping out of the moving cab and doing everything in his power to stop the car that was now dragging his son underneath it. The cab would continue its route for another 10 feet before finally coming to a stop within the Bull in a China Shop section of the ride. Brandon's father would desperately try to lift the car off of his son, but the car simply wouldn't budge an inch. The attendant for the ride quickly realized that something was wrong and swiftly stopped the ride. Brandon's father ran to the attendant and told him what had occurred, begging him for help. The emergency shutoff would be hit and the ride was quickly evacuated. From here, I have heard differing reports on how helpful Disney workers actually were in helping Brandon, with some reports stating that the Disney employees simply stood back while guests at the park would eventually rush to the aid of the child. Upwards of 10 guests made an effort to lift the cab car off of Brandon, but their efforts were in vain as the cab would not budge whatsoever. Eventually, a call was made to the local police department, but many have stated that it took Disney officials far too long to make this call. Police would rush to the scene within minutes, with firefighters following right behind them. The fire department was able to use a jack on the cab car. This jack would finally move the car enough to get Brandon out from underneath it. But at this point, Brandon was completely blue in color. Staff at the park would begin CPR, and soon paramedics would take over, and miraculously, they managed to get a pulse. From there, Brandon would soon be rushed to the UCI Medical Center, where he would immediately be rushed into surgery. The surgery would last hours as Brandon had suffered a ruptured diaphragm, a collapsed left lung, a torn liver and spleen, and a fractured pelvis. He would ultimately survive, but he spent numerous weeks in a coma. His numerous internal injuries and the severe lack of oxygen to the brain had caused irreversible brain damage. Following the tragic accident, an investigation into what transpired would take place. In December of 2000, a state agency in charge of investigating the accident concluded that a likely cause was a lap bar that had malfunctioned along with Brandon's placement next to an opening in the car. Brandon was the smallest rider, and according to policy, he should have been furthest from the cutout doorway, not the one placed right next to it as he had been. Following the tragedy, numerous safety adjustments were made to the ride, with the most notable being that of a sensor that would guard around the bottom of each car. The Zucker family would end up suing Disney. Brandon had survived the ordeal, but his condition would require lifelong medical treatment. Around 17 months after that fateful day, the Zucker family would end up settling with Disney out of court for an undisclosed amount. No details about the settlement have ever been released, but the understanding was that Brandon's medical care would be covered for the rest of his life. Over the next 8 years, Brandon's family would do everything they could for him. He endured numerous surgeries, and the family participated in a ton of different therapies to try and help the young boy. But at the end of the day, Brandon never fully recovered from his injuries. His family would later state that after 8 years, he simply grew tired. That brings us to a Sunday morning in 2009, when Brandon Zucker was found unresponsive within his home. He was rushed to the Children's Hospital of Orange County and eventually passed away the following day at only 13 years old. In the 8 years since his accident, Brandon's family had done all they could to give the young boy the best quality of life possible. I have covered a lot of different stories on the channel, and most of the ones that occur at amusement parks have ended in a swift manner. But Brandon's story may be the most tragic, as his accident left him in a constant struggle for many, many years. For me, it's stories like this that are absolutely heartbreaking. I wish stories like Brandon's didn't have to happen in order for safety to be treated as a higher priority within amusement parks. Brandon's fate could have been avoided if more precautions were taken. Hell, his story could have been prevented altogether if he had just been placed correctly within the taxi cab car. I hope in sharing Brandon's story, we can shine a brighter light on safety within amusement parks in general, as profits should never outweigh the safety of so many lives that visit amusement parks throughout the world. My deepest condolences go out to Brandon Zucker and all of his family and friends. The Matterhorn bobsled opened on June 14, 1959, in Disneyland, which is located in Anaheim, California. The Matterhorn bobsleds are a pair of intertwined steel roller coasters that are modeled after the Matterhorn, a mountain located in the Alps on the border between Switzerland and Italy. It is the first known tubular steel track roller coaster. The ride itself consists of two separate tracks that run parallel to each other for most of the ride. They then intertwine and eventually deviate from one another at the loading areas. The two tracks are called the Fantasyland track and Tomorrowland track, these names stemming from which side of the mountains their loading lines begin. The vehicles originally held up to 4 passengers each, seated single file. But in 1978, after an upgrade was completed, the individual vehicles were joined into pairs with lap seating, which increased the ride's capacity to 8 people per train. The safety restraints on the ride consist of a car seatbelt. There are hand grips inside the cars. Padding within the cars is very limited, and the winding track has many sharp turns. This leads to a bone-shaking ride, reminiscent of an actual bobsled. There is one lift hill on each track. The bobsleds ascend parallel to each other at the start of the ride, climbing past walls featuring snow-like special effects. The top of this lift hill constitutes the highest point of the ride itself, though the mountain continues upward for several more stories. The rest of the ride is a mostly unpowered coast through the Matterhorn's many caverns and passageways. Mark Maples was a 15-year-old teenager who lived with his parents in Long Beach, California. Long Beach is a city in Los Angeles County, California, United States. It is the 43rd most populous city in all of the United States, with a population of around 451,000 residents. It was May 15, 1964, and Mark Maples was enjoying a trip to Disneyland with classmates and friends of his. It was grad night for Stanford Junior High School, and to celebrate, the school had rented out part of the Disneyland park after it closed for the day. From my research, this is a common thing that Southern California schools used to do. At around midnight, Mark Maples boarded the Matterhorn bobsled ride with some classmates of his. It is still unclear what exactly happened, but based on eyewitness accounts and the investigation that took place after the incident, it is believed that during the ride, some sort of bet or dare potentially took place. One of Mark's friends would unbuckle Mark's seatbelt as the Matterhorn sled was about to reach its highest point. The sled was running at around 20 miles per hour at that time. It was at this point that Mark Maples stood up in his seat. This daring decision would end up being a grave mistake for Mark, as he would lose his balance in the process. It is believed that Mark may have hit his head on the side of the mountain while standing up. Now, I have seen differing reports as to what exactly happened to Mark. Some reports say he fell out of the coaster some distance to the ground below, while others believe he hit his head while on the coaster and simply fell out no more than a foot away from where the track was. Either way, Mark was in a bad way following the incident. When the ride would come to an end, Mark's friends would tell ride operators what occurred, but at first they were not believed. After numerous minutes of pleading and trying to convince park workers, the ride was finally shut down and the search for Mark was underway. Mark's body would be found along the track, and emergency personnel would be called to the scene, and Mark would be rushed to the nearby Palm Harbor Hospital. Once there at the hospital, numerous tests were performed to determine the extent of damage that Mark had suffered. Mark had numerous broken ribs and a fractured skull. As Mark fought for his life in the hospital, police began questioning witnesses, trying to piece together what exactly took place. Disney would put out an official statement after the incident saying that Mark unbuckled his safety restraint and stood up on the bobsled as it was entering the summit. The belief was that upon standing, Mark hit his head on the inside of the tunnel and was simply thrown from within the sled. Further interviews with classmates and witnesses brought forth different ideas and details of what transpired. Some believed that Mark was trying to impress his girlfriend, while others thought that one of Mark's friends undid his seatbelt as a prank. The chief deputy would later state that he had received calls claiming that this was a hazing incident gone wrong. No matter where the truth lies, Mark would fight for his life in the hospital for 3 days. But sadly, the young 15-year-old would succumb to his injuries. Ultimately, investigators would end up ruling the death as accidental. Mark Maples would end up being the very first death at Disneyland. He was also the very first to die riding the Matterhorn bobsled, but he would not be the last. On January 3, 1984, 48-year-old Dolly Young, a resident of California, was visiting Disneyland with a small group of friends. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, Dolly and her friends would get in line and eventually board the Matterhorn bobsleds. Dolly would end up sitting in the very back of the bobsled by herself, while her 4 friends sat in pairs in the seats just in front of her. The roughly 70-second ride would begin, and not long into it, another guest on the ride would witness something straight out of a Final Destination horror film. A woman named Helen witnessed Dolly Young fall out of the Matterhorn bobsled. Dolly would go crashing onto another part of the ride's track below. It was said that after Dolly fell, she made an effort to get herself up on the track, but in an instant, another one of the ride's bobsleds would go crashing straight into Dolly. Upon impact, Dolly would be decapitated, and the bobsled would come to a stop on top of what was left of her body. With the bobsled now being stopped, the ride operators would get an alert and immediately shut down the ride in its entirety. Emergency services would be called, and Dolly Young was pronounced dead at the scene. The Anaheim police would immediately start an investigation into what transpired on this fateful day. Unlike a lot of other stories I've told on the channel, the investigation would find no mechanical issues whatsoever with the ride. The only thing that was found was that Dolly Young's seatbelt was undone, but not broken in any way. Disneyland officials would immediately go on to state that prior to the start of the ride, seatbelts are checked on every passenger, not just once, but twice. In stark contrast, one of Dolly's friends was quoted later as saying that they had never checked her seatbelt prior to beginning the ride. To this day, the truth is not 100% apparent. Did Dolly take off her seatbelt herself while on the ride, or did someone forget to check and make sure she was secure prior to the ride beginning? Dolly's family would eventually sue the park for $5 million. This resulted in an undisclosed settlement in March of 1988. Dolly Young was the 5th person to die at Disneyland, and according to my research, as of 2023, 27 people total have lost their lives at the park, but only 7 of those fatalities occurred on rides themselves. As always, my deepest condolences go out to both Mark Maples and Dolly Young, and to anyone who has ever lost someone due to an amusement park accident. California's Great America is a 112-acre amusement park that is located in Santa Clara, California. Santa Clara is a city near San Jose, located in California's Silicon Valley. Santa Clara is known for being the headquarters of numerous tech companies, and it has a population of around 126,000 residents. The Great America Amusement Park originally opened in 1976. The park features over 40 rides and attractions, and if you've ever seen the film Beverly Hills Cop 3, then you will have seen an appearance from the park within that film. Over the years, the park's ownership has changed hands several times, with Prologis being the most recent owner in 2022. The park, as of now, is set to close by the year 2033, in accordance with the land rental agreements that have been put into place. For today's story, we will be discussing a ride that was once known as the Top Gun roller coaster. The ride has changed names over the years, as it was known as the Top Gun from 1993 to 2006. It was then renamed the Flight Deck from 2006 until 2024, with the new name of the coaster now being Soaring Chiefs. A fun fact, the new name came from a bet that was made with Cedar Fair's sister park, Worlds of Fun. Before Super Bowl 58, California's Great America made a bet with its sister park, Worlds of Fun. Worlds of Fun is based in Kansas City, Missouri, the home of the Kansas City Chiefs. The bet entailed that one of the rides in the losing team's theme park had to be renamed in honor of the winning team. The Super Bowl was played between the San Francisco 49ers and the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs would ultimately go on to win Super Bowl 58, and thus the flight deck was subsequently renamed the Soaring Chiefs for the park's 2024 opening weekend. With that fun fact aside, today's story takes us all the way back to 1998, when the ride was still known as Top Gun. It was September 7th, 1998, and a man named Hector Mendoza was visiting the park. Hector was a 25-year-old man from Hayward, California. Hayward is a city located in Alameda County, California, in the East Bay subregion of the San Francisco Bay Area. With a population of around 163,000, Hayward is the 6th largest city in the Bay Area and the 3rd largest in Alameda County. To give you some more context on the roller coaster itself, when it first opened, it was only the second B&M inverted coaster model to have been built. The coaster operates with 2 trains. Each of the 2 trains can accommodate 28 passengers. The passengers are placed in 7 rows, with 4 to a single row. The coaster uses an over-the-shoulder restraint to keep the passengers in place. Unlike a lot of traditional roller coasters that have you sit down within a cart, this roller coaster had you in an upper body shoulder restraint that left your legs dangling while you were experiencing the ride. The coaster exerts a maximum of 4.5 G-forces to its riders while taking them along a track that runs a length of 2,260 feet or 690 meters. At the time of today's story, the coaster was still rocking its Top Gun movie theme, with the roller coaster being made to look like the F-14 Tomcat that Tom Cruise's character in the movie piloted. The queue area of the ride had various displays of an aircraft carrier, while music played from the film's iconic soundtrack. Hector Mendoza was visiting the park at the time with his wife and his brother-in-law. It was reported that he had only just recently gotten married, and this day was meant to be a fun-filled experience for the group. The 3 of them arrived at the park and began walking around, selecting what rides they ultimately wanted to experience. At some point, the group decided to board the Top Gun coaster. While riding the coaster, Hector's wife's hat would end up blowing off of her head. The hat would eventually fall and land in the ride's operating area below. Now, at parks like this, it is not uncommon for people to lose items, especially while riding a roller coaster. In situations like this, it's common for items to be collected at the end of the day when the ride has ceased operation. I tried to find out whether or not Hector ever spoke with anyone about his wife's hat, but I ultimately could not find any information. But what we do know is that Hector got off the ride around 2:30 p.m. that afternoon. He then proceeded to scale the fence around the ride. The fence was there to keep people out of the ride's operating areas, as access was only meant for those that worked there at the park. The area itself was extremely hazardous, with signs indicating this posted along the fence. But Hector was determined to recover his wife's hat, and so he scaled the fence and jumped over to the other side. As Hector was doing this, a 28-year-old woman named Jessica Medina was boarding the Top Gun roller coaster. She too had been enjoying a fun-filled day at the park. As she boarded the coaster, she had no idea that physical and mental anguish soon awaited her. As the coaster began its trip around the 2,260-foot track, Hector Mendoza had finally located his wife's hat. But Hector had no idea that the area he was in was one of the lowest points that the track of the roller coaster ran through. The cart holding Jessica Medina was in the midst of its run along the track. Her legs were dangling, and she was having a blast. She had no idea what was about to happen. As the coaster closed in on where Hector was standing, Jessica Medina's dangling leg would make contact with Hector's skull at around 50 miles per hour, or 80.4 kilometers per hour. Jessica Medina was immediately thrust into excruciating pain as the coaster continued its course around the track. Upon ending the ride, it was clear that something horrible had just taken place. The ride would be immediately stopped, and the police and emergency personnel would be called to the scene. Jessica Medina was immediately sent to the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center along with Hector Mendoza. Jessica would ultimately survive the ordeal with a badly broken leg, but the emotional scar would be something that would stay with her for the rest of her life, as 25-year-old Hector Mendoza was pronounced dead around 1 hour after he was taken to the hospital. His wife's hat still laid in the unrestricted area, with crime scene tape and an investigation into what happened now underway. Now, for the most part in stories involving accidents at amusement parks, things like greed play a big role in what transpired. Big amusement parks have been known to sacrifice safety for profits, and they tend to get away with it. But in some instances, tragedy is all that comes from the lack of safety or training. Now, I want to say that I am in no way victim blaming. What happened to Hector should not have happened, but at the end of the day, Hector made the decision to climb that fence and place himself into a highly dangerous restricted area. I found during my research that Hector primarily spoke Spanish, and his lack of English speaking may be part of the reason he did not heed the signs and the warnings along the ride's fencing. At the same time, I can't imagine Hector didn't know that he was entering an area he wasn't supposed to be entering. He may not have understood how great the danger was, and sadly, this decision claimed his life and left his new wife a widow. Following the incident, the park made changes to their warning signs. They no longer just read in English, but they have numerous translations into numerous other languages. The hope is that a change like this will prevent anyone else from suffering a similar horrible fate. At the end of the day, Jessica Medina was left scarred physically and mentally. Bruises, bones, and cuts can heal, but the mental scars are something that the poor woman will have to carry with her for the rest of her life. I hope she has found some peace within with what happened, for she was not in control of Hector or the decision he made on that fateful day. As always, my deepest condolences go out to Hector Mendoza, his wife, his family, and his friends, as well as to Jessica Medina. I hope she has found peace within and has a wonderful life going forward. Thank you all for tuning in to another episode, and if you enjoy the content, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps the channel continue to grow, and it's 100% free for you to do. Also, if you want to make sure you never miss a new upload on the channel, you can turn on that bell notification after you've subscribed. In the description box below, you will find a link to my merch store and a link to the Cellar Dwellers membership tier for the channel. If you're interested, please take a moment to check those things out. If you'd like to submit your own scary story or any kind of story recommendation, you can do so using the email that is also linked in the description box below. As always, I do all the research, writing, recording, and editing for the channel myself, so anything that you do to support this channel is greatly appreciated. And until next time, I will see you all again as we head back into the cellar.